to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is January 11th, 2026, and tonight's episode is all about part 7 of our examination of Judges. Yes, the book of Judges, examined between the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox Church and the King James canon. Yes, we're going to go side by side and figure out what the heck's going on there. Now, what follows here is not a story about a violent God or a failed people. It is a record of what happens when covenant is inherited without being remembered. Seems like the children of Israel have bad memories. And when freedom is received without any discipline to sustain it. And nothing new is introduced here, as everything that unfolds has already been warned about, named, and permitted long before it appears. The book of Judges does not describe God changing posture. It actually reveals what becomes visible when restraint is no longer reinforced by obedience. Deliverance still comes, mercy still interrupts collapse, and cries are still heard, but the ground underneath those cries is very, very thin. Relief replaces repentance, and memory fades even faster each time peace returns to Israel. So what unravels in this record is not leadership alone, but reference. When authority is no longer anchored in covenant, everything becomes their own measure. And what feels right replaces what was commanded. And sincerity begins to masquerade as faithfulness. The absence that defines this era is not God's presence, but remembered obedience. The repetition is deliberate. The cycles are not punishment escalating, but exposure deepening. The same failure is allowed to surface again and again until it can no longer be mistaken for accident or misunderstanding. Now, this is not cruelty on God's part. It is patience that refuses to lie about consequence. Judges stands as a mirror held steady, not a verdict shouted in anger. It shows what happens when a people cannot carry freedom without structure, mercy without memory, or inheritance without formation. So nothing here is meant to terrify. It is meant to be seen clearly and without any excuse. I'm excited about tonight. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble. Number one warrior is Boots Hafner. Boots stating, let's get ready to rumble with your host of the Rumble Airwaves and creator of Elite Potion, James Carner. Hello, fellow warriors. Hoping everyone is feeling all right. Please hit that thumbs up button. Yes, if you'll do it with me, hit the X, then hit thumbs up, and then hit the live chat. There you go. If you did it with me, then we'll get some more likes because Rumble only judges me based off of that. Number 2 warrior is Scorpion saying, hey, family, glad to be back. Welcome, guys, tonight to another interesting show. Now on to breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
What do I know about breaking news? Now, tonight's breaking news distills to three to four stories that cut through the noise and reveal where pressure is being applied right now on information, on money, and on stability itself. Now, these are not random events. They are stress points where control is tested and discernment is required. The first and foremost urgent story comes out of Iran, where authorities have restricted internet access, as we said last night, as nationwide protests continue to spread under severe economic strain. Now, when a government turns off communication, it is signaling fear of uncontrolled truth more than fear of the disorder itself. And in New World Order terms, information control is increasingly treated as national security because whoever controls the narrative controls the response. Now, for the children of God, you guys, the reminder here is steady and ancient. Truth does not need permission to survive. Prayer now is for protection, courage, and wisdom for those whose voices are being pushed into silence, and for believers to remember that the word endured long before modern networks ever existed. The second story tonight is unfolding in the United States, where a pending Supreme Court decision on tariffs and executive authority is creating unease across global markets and trade corridors. Now, while the case sounds technical, its implications are not. Now, in New World Order terms, courts have become quiet architects of economic power. Yeah, a control mechanism. And shaping supply chains and national strategy without a single soldier even moving, which is why the Supreme Court justices always need guardians and to be monitored and watched for being blackmailed and whatnot. And now, when wealth and stability hinge on legal outcomes and policy interpretation, it exposes how fragile economic confidence really is. So provision comes from God, not from favorable rulings or managed markets. The third story tonight is environmental but deeply political, as severe winter storms all across parts of Europe disrupt transportation, energy systems, and daily life for millions of people. Pray for them. Now, in New World Order terms, natural disruption often becomes the gateway for expanded emergency authority and centralized response, power. Crisis compresses resistance, and for the children of God, this moment calls for compassion over commentary. When you're online, don't try to tell people, well, I told you so. Respond to people the way that they need. They need encouragement. They need love and self-improvement. They don't need to be told what to do or what they didn't do because this outcome came. This is a chance for you to shine as you're online arguing with people over economic stuff or world wars or whatever it is. Serve your neighbors. Have compassion. Help wherever possible and resist the pull of fear. Creation still answers to its creator, and humility in the face of nature is not weakness. It is wisdom. Let me explain it to you this way. The book that God created has ended. He's already written the ending. He's in control of it. He knows exactly what's going on. So the least you can do is, instead of try to be right or stand up for yourself or stand up for your country, think of the others and what they need. They need your compassion. They need your support. They need your love. And they need your wisdom and guidance. Because they're not, oh, ow, man, I just ripped a nice little hangnail right up my finger. Can you believe that? Ow, that hurts. Look at that. That's all skin. Look at that. My God. So that happened. Ow. Be humble. Use wisdom. And our fourth headline, one that has generated significant discussion today online, comes from the United States Postal Service. Verified internal notices distributed to USPS staff, United States Postal Service, and contractors alone instruct employees to carry their official USPS identification and essential services documents when traveling to and from work during emergencies or restrictions that could limit movement. While these instructions are intended to ensure that postal workers can continue to perform designated essential duties under emergency protocols, and is similar to guidance that was widely used during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, people are freaking out saying, oh my God, another COVID's being released, or oh my God, World War is coming, or oh my God, this means we're all going to die. Well, in New World Order terms, the designation of essential services and the documentation required for mobility reflect how states categorize participation in public life. This wasn't issued to every single state. It was issued just to a few. Not all. And systems increasingly differentiate between those who are authorized and those who are not, especially in conditions of stress or uncertainty, which we live in right now after Trump took over Venezuela. Now, I have my opinions about it. I do believe that Trump said he's going after the governors, the CEOs, and all those who have been up against him. It could be just in blue states, there will be civil unrest because, well, Trump's going after those governors just like he did with the leader of Venezuela. That's what I think is happening because it's all about oil, right? And it's all about money. And the Federal Reserve is tired of China and Russia gaining strength with BRICS. And so they are going to take out all of those working with Russia and China. And you may believe it or not, it's my opinion, and from the information that I've gathered, the Democrat National Committee, if it's not them, it's the blue states that have ports that are getting paybacks or buyouts from China. And that simply isn't American, okay? And Trump was going to send the National Guard to each of those blue states with ports to stop them from doing these underground deals because China is desperate, so is Russia, to get oil. And the only way that they can get numerous globs of oil is through the black market, that means painting different flags on ships for protection. This is what's really going on. Now, for the children of God, this is a moment to temper interpretation with discernment. Carrying an ID to do a designated job does not in itself signal martial law or a hidden agenda, okay? Chill out. But it does underscore how quickly societies lean on administrative categories in times of tension, because people are freaking out now. Well, nobody knew about these letters being sent before COVID. So this is just probably a way to get us off of looking at what Trump just did to Venezuela and look at, oh my God, we're going to have another pandemic. My opinion, they're not going to have another pandemic. That's just it. They did it once back during the Spanish flu, and it worked. And they did it again, and it worked. And they have another 100 years until everybody forgets about that lie, okay? So the faithful response here is not to live in fear, but try to use clarity about the nature of service, obedience, and lawful order, and unwavering trust in God's sovereignty over every circumstance. He's in control. Chill out. And taken together, tonight's news points to pressure on communication, power, legal authority, public safety, and mobility. And in each case, systems respond to stress by tightening control. But believers are summoned to respond not in panic, but with discernment, prayer, and mercy, anchoring hope not in earthly structures, but in the one who holds all things steady, even when storms and upheavals swirl around us. We're like the apostles in the boat, and Jesus is asleep, and it looks like the storm is going to kill us all. Well, we need to chill out, honey bunny, and take a step back and just realize that we live in a world where there's going to be ups and downs. America had a good run. How many years we went without anyone coming after us? Well, it's been quite some time. And, well, we've done a lot of bad things to the world. And just like what Ron Paul said, I don't really believe he was a good person, neither is his son, but I do believe that they were Freemasons. But regardless, they said, hey, blowback is coming from all of the policing that we did around the world. That ain't on me. That's just what they're doing. We're going to go to a quick commercial. When we get back, we're going to be talking about Part 7, the examination of judges, the Ethiopian, Tewahedo, Orthodox, and King James records. Stick around.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
I'll give you $10,000 if you can find just one person who's never filed a tax return.
I'll give you $10,000 if you can find just one person who's never filed a tax return.
Have you ever filed a tax return? Yes.
Nobody. Not one. It starts at 16. That first job, that first form. The moment they became a taxpayer. Every April 15th, millions keep signing the same contract, thinking it's the law. But it isn't the law that binds them. It's the signature. 98% of Americans never owed it. Learn more at unincorporatedassociations.com.
All right, we're back, and tonight we're talking about the book of Judges. And just to give you guys a little heads up of what we've been going through, I have done a thorough translation of the Ge'ez to Amharic to English version of the Ethiopian canon. It is the Orthodox version kept from the 5th, 6th century scrolls of when they took the originals from around the Middle East and they rewrote it in their own language. Now, it's been passed on through a few languages up to English, but the difference between the Ethiopian canon and the King James version are astounding. And what we've been learning is it seems that the Western version of the Old and New Testament paints this picture of an angry God, while the Ethiopian canon paints the picture of a merciful, loving God who gave several chances. And it's quite interesting how the West just forgot all of that. Well, we've been speaking about how the children of God, within a few years, forgot about God while they were living right beside him. So this isn't anything new under the sun. Information has been hidden on purpose to keep Rome in power. And we're learning that as we go through every single book from 1 to number 66 of the King James Bible, comparing it to the Ethiopian canon. Now, Judges begins where obedience has already been proven possible and where failure can no longer be blamed on ignorance. The land has been entered, the covenant has been heard, and the memory of God's faithfulness is still close enough to touch. What follows is not a confusion about what God wants, but erosion of the will to hold it by the people. This book records what happens when truth is known, but no longer guarded. Now, nothing in Judges suggests that God becomes harsher or more unpredictable. The same mercy that delivered before continues to interrupt collapse, but it no longer produces lasting change. Relief is mistaken for restoration, and peace is treated as permission to forget. Now, what weakens over time is not God's response, but the people's capacity to remain aligned once pressure lifts. Now, the cycles that define this record are not random, and they are not theatrical. They exist because the same root problem is never addressed. It's only managed. And each return to God or to disorder looks familiar because it is familiar. And each deliverance feels weaker because it is shorter lived. Repetition here is not God losing patience. It is truth refusing to be hidden, as the children of God still cannot act like children of God. Now, the absence that dominates here, Judges, is often misunderstood. It is not simply the absence of a king, and it is not the absence of law. It is the absence of a shared reference point that binds obedience to memory rather than your mood. When everyone becomes the measure of what is right, when all of the children of Israel stop sinning and be good people, well, sincerity replaces submission and instinct replaces covenant. When everyone becomes the measure of what is right. But that's the difference, well, what they think is right? But not going on what God said, okay? This is basically saying, well, we think it's right that you say thou shalt not murder, and what if the person stole, your calf? You can murder them, right? Well, murder is murder is murder. And this is where the children of Israel started to write more laws. Okay. Now, when everyone becomes the measure of what is right, sincerity replaces submission to God, and instinct then replaces covenant. Now, the judges themselves are not presented here as ideals to imitate. They rise because mercy still responds to cries. But because the people have become faithful again, not because the people have become faithful again. Their flaws are not accidental details. They are evidence of how far the standard has slipped. Again, God continues to work through imperfect instruments without endorsing the disorder that makes them necessary. Now, as the book progresses, the noise increases and the clarity then fades. Violence becomes internal, brother turns against brother, and what was once unthinkable becomes tolerated. God's voice does not grow louder because it has already been spoken. What changes is how little remains to restrain what has been repeatedly chosen. And God continues to give, and they continue to take. And they seem to forget the covenant that they made with God, just the simple 10 commandments. And Judges here does not end with resolution because it is not meant to. It leaves the listener with a question that cannot be avoided: whether freedom can survive without remembered obedience. This record does not accuse, threaten, or dramatize. It simply holds the mirror steady long enough for the pattern to be seen. Now, Judges opens with the pattern already forming, but not with a crisis just that came out of nowhere. The land has been entered, the covenant has been spoken, and the memory of deliverance is still near. Meaning, God promised them the land. They got the land. God isn't going to break his promise. He's going to make sure that he will get them to the land, give it to them, and then, hey, it's up to them if they're going to continue listening to him, because it seems every time when they do listen to God, meaning stop sinning, they win wars. But when they start sinning, they lose them. So what begins to fail is not knowledge, but attention. Obedience loosens quietly before it actually collapses openly. Now, the Ethiopian Tewahedo record names this drift without any drama, because it says, and I quote, Ethiopian, "And the children of Israel did evil before the Lord, and they served Baal." Well, that ain't good. We know who Baal and Moloch are now. "And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them." The language here moves in one direction. They forsake, they follow. The emphasis is departure, not explosion. And the King James speaks the same moment with sharper emotional force as it reads, and I quote King James, "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served Balaam, and provoked the Lord to anger." Well, the action is the same, but the tone definitely shifts. Where one records stress, loss of allegiance, the other prepares the ear for divine reaction. You provoked the Lord to anger. Look out. Then the consequence arrives. The Ethiopian text says, and I quote, "And the anger of the Lord was strong against Israel, and he removed his protection from them," because they weren't worshiping him. They were worshiping Baal. Baal and Moloch are the baby eaters. "And he gave them over into the hands of spoilers who plundered them." Now, the sequence matters here, as protection is removed first. Exposure then follows, and the suffering enters where restraint no longer stands. God didn't send in the bad guys to beat them up. No, he just let the world happen. Now, the King James renders the same moment as, and it says, and I quote, King James, "And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of spoilers that spoiled them." Now, spoken aloud, the verb sounds very active, and one can easily hear punishment being imposed rather than protection being withdrawn. Big difference. Ethiopian, God had to withdraw his protection of them. Hey, you don't want to worship me, you want to worship Baal. You want to sacrifice your firstborns and babies to Baal. All right, then I'm going to let go of my protection. That doesn't mean that God went to other cities and said, "Hey, go destroy my children." Not at all. He's doing what they asked. They didn't want him. They weren't worshiping him. So the verb sounds active, and one can easily hear punishment being imposed rather than protection being withdrawn. There's a big difference here. The Ethiopian canon shows us who God really is, while the King James Version shows us some other person, or thing, or entity, or King of Kings, which doesn't exist. As the pressure spreads, the Ethiopian record continues. It says, Ethiopian. Wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, and they were greatly distressed. Now, the weight rests on distress. The people feel the consequence of their condition, not the volatility of God. Now, the King James says, and I quote King James, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, and they were greatly distressed. Now, to modern ears, the phrase for evil can sound as though God himself has become the source of harm, even though the context remains covenant consequence. He simply let his hand off of them. Let whatever happen may happen. No protection. That's on them. So then mercy interrupts. Now, the Ethiopian text states simply, and I quote Ethiopian, nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them, unquote. So there is no hesitation here, no emotional buildup. Deliverance arrives because mercy has not departed. God let off and said, okay, here's how you want to run it. And then they started screaming, oh my God, we made a mistake. God goes, okay, and he sends judges to help. So there's no emotional buildup. Deliverance arrives because mercy has never departed. Now, the King James mirrors it. It says, quote, King James, nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. So both records agree. God responds. Rescue is real. Compassion has not failed. But the Ethiopian paints a better picture of how God actually reacts and who he is. So what stands exposed here is not whether God is merciful, but how wording shapes perception. One cadence preserves a God who warns, allows, withdraws restraint, and then responds to distress. The other can sound to modern ears like a God whose anger initiates suffering, and that's simply not true. Now, Judges begins by placing this distinction on the table without apology. Obedience weakens, protection lifts, distress follows, mercy intervenes. Memory fades again. Nothing here suggests a God eager to punish. It reveals a patient God who allows consequence when covenant is no longer held, and who still answers when his people cry. So this is the pattern that Judges refuses to soften. And it begins here, in the words themselves, where interpretation ever enters the room, or before interpretation ever enters the room. Now, the cycle does not end with deliverance here. That is the quiet danger. Judges exposes next. Rescue arrives, pressure lifts, and life stabilizes, but nothing is rebuilt deeply enough to last. What was interpreted is not healed. What was spared is not reformed. The Ethiopian record says it plainly. In Judges, it says, and I quote Ethiopian, yet they did not listen to their judges, but they went after other gods and bowed themselves to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked, obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. So the emphasis fails on speed here. The turning back happens quickly. Obedience is abandoned almost as soon as relief arrives. So the King James records the same truth, but with a different sound. It says, and I quote King James, and yet they would not hearken unto their judges, and they went a-whoring after other gods and bowed themselves unto them. It says that they went a-whoring after other gods. Well, the phrase carries moral heat here, and the action is the same, but the language feels sharper, heavier, and more accusatory when spoken aloud. Now, listen to how God's posture is described as the cycle continues. In the Ethiopian text, it says, I quote Ethiopian, and when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved with compassion because of their groaning, unquote. Compassion is named here directly. It says compassion. God's presence does not fluctuate with mood. He remains with the deliverer because the people are suffering. Now, the King James reads, and I quote King James, and when the Lord raised up judges, then the Lord was with the judges and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For it repented the Lord because of their groanings. So to modern ears, the word repented can sound like regret or a reversal in God, even though the action remains compassionate. Then the record turns darker in the King James. But Ethiopian goes. Ethiopian, I quote, "But it came to pass when the judge was dead that they turned back to corrupted themselves more than their fathers, following other gods to serve them and bow to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way." So the language exposes progression, the corruption deepens, the behavior hardens, and the problem is no longer drift alone, but refusal to change. The King James renders it as this, I quote King James, "And it came to pass when the judge was dead, that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way." So the agreement here is complete, but what differs is not the conclusion, but the emotional texture surrounding it. Now listen carefully to how God responds, or how God's response is framed. The Ethiopian text says, and I quote Ethiopian, "And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant," stop following the 10 commandments, "which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice." Unquote. Well, the anger here is stated, but it is followed immediately by explanation. Okay? God names covenant violation, not emotional offense. Unlike the King James, where it says, and I quote King James, "And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, because that this people hath transgressed my covenant, and hath not hearkened unto my voice." Well, the words are nearly identical, yet the tone remains heavier to the English ear. So what becomes clear here is not a God growing impatient, but a problem becoming entrenched. Each cycle leaves the people less responsive, less teachable, and less capable of sustaining obedience once mercy intervenes. God does not withdraw compassion. He withdraws illusions. And deliverance without memory produces dependence without transformation. As Judges does not hide this, it repeats it until the excuse of misunderstanding collapses. So the issue is no longer whether God will save, it is whether the people will change once they are saved. And they did it. They started to get robbed and looted, and they go, "Oh, yeah, come get us." And God comes and sends a judge, and the judge wipes them all out, and then they're like, "All right, nah, thanks a lot. We're going to go back to our porno." So this is the second turn of the spiral here. Mercy still comes. Compassion is still named. But the ground beneath obedience is thinning here. And each return to disorder sinks deeper than the last return. Judges does not rush past this. It actually slows down so the listener can no longer pretend the pattern is accidental. The people are thick-necked. And with that pattern now exposed twice, the book begins preparing the ear for something far more dangerous than foreign oppression, collapse from within. Now, by the third turn of the cycle, the danger is no longer external. Judges begin shifting attention away from foreign oppressors and toward something far more destructive. The threat is no longer what presses in from the outside, but what collapses from within once reference is lost. I mean, when you forget about God's covenants. Just simple 10 commandments. Now, the Ethiopian record marks this transition carefully. It states, and I quote Ethiopian, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Each man did what was right in his own eyes." So the sentence is not dramatic. It's diagnostic. It's pretty much anarchy. Now, it does not accuse leadership structures, but it exposes the absence of shared authority rooted in covenant memory, meaning they just did their own thing. They listened to Aleister Crowley instead of the Father. So yeah, the Ethiopian record marks this transition carefully, and the King James renders the same line, and I quote King James, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." So the wording is nearly identical, yet when spoken aloud, it often lands political commentary instead of spiritual diagnosis. So the King James text itself does not demand that reading. It simply records what happens when obedience loses its anchor. Now, that's not a bad thing, but there's still, even through Judges, a huge difference between how God acts and what he says versus the King James. So what follows proves my point. The Ethiopian text begins to show Israel turning against itself. It describes internal conflict, moral inversion, and unchecked violence without introducing new commands or divine escalations. So the people are no longer merely forgetting God. They are redefining good and evil according to their own convenience. Now, the King James presents the same unraveling, but the heightened English phrasing can make it sound as though God is actively driving the chaos. Well, it's all God. Well, that's what Satan would want you to think. Yet the text never says that God commands the internal violence. It records what happens when restraint is gone and no authority remains to check desire. When you're worshiping another God, you're not following the Father and just 10 simple commandments. He has to let go because you asked him to. They're simply doing what they want, and God is providing what they want. Oh, you don't want my protection? Okay, I'll let go. Now listen to how God's posture is preserved even as disorder starts spreading in Israel. The Ethiopian record does not introduce new threats. It does not escalate language. God's voice becomes rarer, but not harsher. Silence grows, but not wrath. The absence of intervention is not abandonment, but exposure. What the people have chosen is finally allowed to stand without any interpretation and without any interruption. So the King James, read without context, can make that silence feel ominous or punitive. But placed alongside the Ethiopian cadence, the meaning actually sharpens. God has already spoken. What remains is the consequence of ignoring what was said. So this is where Judges becomes uncomfortable to the believer who is reading the King James. Not because God turns cruel, but because he stops shielding the people from the full weight of their own disorder. So the text does not rush to explain or even soften this. It lets the listener sit with the result of unanchored freedom. And unfortunately, the King James just makes us believe in an angry God. So by this point, deliverers still appear, but they are weaker reflections of what came before. The judges no longer correct any direction. They interpret disaster briefly. The people no longer return to obedience. They return to habit. Now, Judges is now making something unavoidably clear. When covenant is no longer remembered, freedom does not produce righteousness. It produces fragmentation. Authority does not vanish. It relocates it into the self, and the self proves incapable of sustaining justice. It's true. So this is not presented as tragedy or shock value. It is presented as evidence. The text is showing what inevitably follows when everyone becomes their own measure and God allows that choice to unfold without interference. So by the time this turn is complete, the problem can no longer be blamed on enemies or leadership gaps or even misunderstanding. The issue is internal, structural, and self-sustaining. And from here forward, Judges will no longer look outward for the source of collapse. It will look inward, where restraint has been replaced by instinct and memory has been given way to impulse. So by this stage in Judges, the collapse has moved inward. We've been talking about that. The disorder no longer sits only with the people. It now shows up inside the very figures raised up to restrain it. God still intervenes, but the nature of that intervention has narrowed. What is being restored is stability and not holiness. So the Ethiopian Tewahedo record describes this very carefully. In Judges, it says, "And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, and went out to war. And the Lord delivered Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram, into his hand, and his hand prevailed against Cushan Rishathaim." So the Spirit comes for action. Judgment is executed. Deliverance occurs. Nothing is said about inner transformation. The King James speaks the same moment with nearly identical wording. It says, I quote King James, "And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, and went out to war. And the Lord delivered Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand." Now, spoken aloud, the language can easily sound like approval of the man himself, just approval of the judge who judges Israel. And the language can easily sound like approval of the man himself. So yet the text never claims that, as power is present, but endorsement is not even stated. So when the task is complete, both records fall silent in the same way. The Ethiopian text says, quote, so the land had rest 40 years, then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. There's no celebration, no moral conclusion. Rest ends when the judge's life ends. So the King James mirrors it exactly. It says, and I quote King James, and the land had rest 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. The silence is deliberate. Nothing lasting has been formed. Now, as the cycle continues, the pattern sharpens rather than improves. Judges says again in the Ethiopian record, quote, Ethiopian, and when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, a left-handed man. Well, the description is functional, not flattering. God raises what restrains collapse, not what represents renewal. And we know of the people of the left-hand path. I think God just gave them a Satanist to watch over them. Well, that's what you wanted. So the King James records the same words. It says, I quote King James, but when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised them up a deliverer, a man left-handed. So spoken alone, the detail can feel colorful. Spoken alongside the Ethiopian cadence, it feels improvised. This is mercy adapting to decline and not selecting excellence. So what neither record ever says here is just as important as what they say clearly. No judge is declared righteous. No covenant renewal is announced. No heart change is recorded. Deliverance happens, but formation does not. So Judges is now exposing a sobering truth. God will still act through broken people when restraint is necessary. He will empower action without redefining righteousness. He will interrupt collapse without pretending the condition is healed. The Ethiopian text preserves this with restraint. The King James can sound more heroic to modern ears, but the events themselves refuse to lie. Each judge delivers. Each cycle resets only at the surface. The ground underneath remains unstable. So by now, the difference between power and alignment, it should be unmistakable. Victories still occur, but they do not rebuild obedience. Mercy is present, but memory is thin. Authority functions, but covenant is no longer carried. They did not want to worship God until they get into trouble. And that's not how he works. But he still comes anyway because he loves them. But he has to still save them and then let go and not protect them. So Judges is not condemning these figures. It is recording them honestly. And in doing so, it shows that even God-given victories cannot restore a people who no longer hold covenant within themselves. So from here forward, the consequences will no longer stay confined to individual leaders. The disorder will spread outward and into the life of the nation itself, where restraint grows rarer and the cost of forgetting becomes impossible to ignore. So by the time Judges reaches its later cycle, something decisive has shifted. God is no longer speaking less because he has become distant. He is speaking less because nothing new needs to be said. The warnings have already been given. The pattern has already been proven. The restraint has already been lifted and restored more times than he can count. The Ethiopian Tewahedo record makes this unmistakable, as it says in Judges, and I quote, Ethiopian. The Lord was moved with compassion because of their groaning under those who oppressed them and afflicted them. Well, compassion is named directly here. God's response is not irritation. It is sorrow paired with restraint. The King James renders the same line as, and I quote King James, it repented the Lord because of the groanings by reason of them. The word repented here. Wait, I skipped a line. It repented the Lord because of their groanings by reason of them that oppressed them and vexed them. Well, spoken aloud, the word repented can sound like emotional reversal, as though God regrets his own actions. Well, the Ethiopian wording preserves something steadier. God is not changing his mind. He is responding consistently to suffering. Now listen to what follows when deliverance ends. The Ethiopian text reads, and I quote, Ethiopian. But when the judge was dead, they turned back and corrupted themselves more than their fathers. Well, The decline here is not static, it deepens as each cycle leaves the people less responsive than even before. And the King James mirrors it. It says, I quote King James, "And it came to pass when the judge was dead that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers." The agreement here between both canons are exact. The problem is no longer confusion, it's persistence. So at this stage, God's response is no longer framed as dramatic action. It's framed as decision. He can only do what he says he's going to do. He gave the law. He told them the consequences. They continued to break the law. So the Ethiopian record says that the Lord declares he will no longer drive out the nations before Israel. It says, and I quote in Ethiopian, "In order to test Israel, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did." Well, the language here is measured. God allows conditions to remain so the truth of obedience can be revealed. Now, the King James reads, and I quote King James, "That through them I may prove Israel whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk therein." Well, spoken alone, the word prove can sound adversarial, as though God is setting traps here. Spoken alongside the Ethiopian cadence, it sounds diagnostic. The test reveals what already exists. So what's happening here is not divine escalation. It is divine honesty. God is no longer shielding the people from the environment that exposes their condition. If obedience is real, it will endure. If it is shallow, it will collapse. It's very simple to understand. They just didn't want to worship God anymore. Why? Well, that's a good question. Probably because God doesn't give them things instantly, just like they had in Egypt. Now, Judges is now showing that mercy does not always remove difficulty. Sometimes mercy allows reality to remain so that self-deception cannot survive. This is not punishment. It is exposure. The Ethiopian wording preserves this posture very clearly. God does not say he will destroy his people. He says he will stop removing what reveals them. Now, the King James can sound harsher in English, but the substance is the same here. God is no longer intervening to prevent the consequences of repeated choice. So by this point, the listener can no longer imagine an angry God losing control. What stands in plain view is a patient God refusing to lie. The people have been rescued so many times to know better. And what remains to see is whether obedience can exist at all without constant rescue. So they're being tested. God's coming in and saving them at the last minute, but they continue to worship Baal and Moloch. So Judges is no longer about deliverers rising. It's about conditions being allowed to stand. And that shift is more severe than any foreign oppression because it removes the illusion that mercy will always erase consequence. So from here forward, the book will move steadily towards something unavoidable. When restraint is lifted long enough, what is hidden inside a people will eventually surface in full view. Not because God forces it out, but because nothing remains to keep it concealed. And something popped into my head while I was reading this. I scrolled through TikTok, Facebook, other social media platforms, and I always see, prophets online saying that God is judging America. God's judging America. That's not biblical. God is letting go of his protection of America. There's a difference. That's not him judging us for our psycho minds. It's not even judging us. God is having to, because of us, restrain himself from helping. So he's not angry. He's not mad. He has shown us through the Bible and through the Ethiopian canon what he's all about. He's not judging America because America took him out of the court system or out of school system or out of, anything. Or that we are, a perverted society, flurries making love to each other. He's not judging us for that. He's saying, do all those things and I can't help you from the destruction that Satan wants to commit on you. That's really it. You see, if you follow his commands, this is what it's saying, pre-Jesus dying for our sin, but if you follow his commands, and they're just simple, they're just 10, then you will live righteous and happy and be free from evil. But it doesn't work unless it doesn't save a country unless everyone in that country lives that same way, lives by those standards. As we shown last night, just one person was evil against Israel, and all of Israel were in trouble. But they weren't in trouble from God. They were in trouble from Satan, as Satan was waiting for any way to get his hands in to get them. So from here forward, the book will move steadily towards something unavoidable. When restraint is lifted long enough, when God isn't protecting you long enough, what's hidden inside a people will eventually surface in full view, as we're seeing right now. Everyone is just insane right now in America. And it's not because God forces it out. It's because nothing remains to keep it concealed. So by this stage in Judges, something more unsettling than violence actually appears. God's voice begins to recede. And not because he has abandoned his people, but because intervention itself has become the obstacle to truth being seen. The silence that settles is not neglect, it's allowance. Now, the Ethiopian Tewahedo record shows this shift without any drama. In Judges 10, after repeated deliverance and repeated corruption, the peoples cry out again, and God answers differently. It says, and I quote Ethiopian, "And the Lord said to the children of Israel, did I not deliver you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites, from the Ammonites and from the Philistines? You have forsaken me and served other gods. Therefore, I will deliver you no more." So the response is not anger, it's history. God recounts what he has already done and names what has not changed. Now, the King James renders this exchange with heavier emotional weight. It reads, I quote King James, "Yet ye have forsaken me and served other gods. Wherefore I will deliver you no more." Now, spoken alone, it can sound final, even harsh. Spoken beside the Ethiopian cadence, it sounds judicial. God is not withdrawing compassion. He is withdrawing rescue that has failed to produce change. Hey, I have saved you from all these other wars, and you still want to worship the devil. I can't help you, kid. Then the people respond. In the Ethiopian text, it says, I quote Ethiopian, "And the children of Israel said to the Lord, we have sinned. Do to us whatever seems good to you. Only deliver us this day." Now, the words admit sin, but they still ask for immediate relief. So the pattern remains intact. Now, in the King James, it echoes this, and I quote King James, "We have sinned. Do thou unto us whatsoever seemeth good until thee. Deliver us only, we pray thee, this day." The confession sounds deeper in English, yet the request remains urgent and present-focused. In fact, I read it differently. I read the Ethiopian way of they were pretty much like kind of not desperate, but just conceited. So that really makes a difference understanding who these people are. They know God will deliver them because God has at the last minute. So they're using God. And God knows this and realizes it, and he's not going to be used. But in the King James, you wouldn't even know that unless you read the Ethiopian. Let me read it again so you can understand this. Ethiopian says, "And the children of Israel said to the Lord, we have sinned. Do to us whatever seems good to you, and deliver us this day." And then the King James, "We have sinned. Do thou unto us whatsoever seemeth good unto thee. Deliver us only, we pray thee, this day." Two different things. Now listen to what follows, because this is where wording matters the most. The Ethiopian record says, I quote, "And they put away the foreign gods, temporarily, from among them and served the Lord, and his soul was grieved for the misery of Israel." Now, God's response is grief, not rage. Isn't that kind of a big deal? The movement of mercy is emotional restraint and not ignition. Now, the King James reads it differently. King James says, I quote King James, And they put away the strange gods from among them and served the Lord, and his soul was grieved for the misery of Israel. Here, both records agree completely. The posture is sorrow, not fury. But what changes in Judges is not God's heart. What changes is God's method. Deliverance no longer arrives immediately. Space is allowed to exist between repentance and rescue. The Ethiopian wording preserves this as patience. God waits. He watches whether obedience will stand without instant reward. And the King James makes this pause feel ominous, as though judgment is looming. Oh, I'm going to come get you. I'm going to come get you. Well, read alongside the Ethiopian text, the pause sounds different. It's restraint. It is honesty. It is God refusing to be manipulated by short-lived repentance. This silence does something that rescue never could. It exposes whether obedience is real or performative. When relief is delayed, the people are forced to sit with their condition instead of escaping it. Judges is now making its most uncomfortable move. God is still present. He's still listening, but he is no longer cushioning every fall. What has been chosen repeatedly is now being allowed to show its full weight. Now, this is not abandonment. It's maturity being demanded. And the Ethiopian record keeps God's character intact throughout this shift. The King James, when heard without comparison, can sound severe. But together, the words reveal the same truth. God has not grown angry. He has grown still, meaning patient with them. And that stillness marks the moment when exposure becomes unavoidable, because nothing remains between a people and the consequences of what they have refused to release. So from here forward, Judges will no longer be about cycles repeating. It will be about collapse accelerating until the cost of forgetting covenant can no longer be denied. And that's not on God. That's on them. Ooh. Hold on. Oh, that hurts. I don't know if you can see that, but oh. Yeah, there's just a big old thing of skin. Oh. So, at this point, Judges, the pattern no longer resets. What had repeated now compounds. The book moves from cycles into convergence, and where multiple failures overlap and restraint is no longer sufficient to keep disorder localized, well, the Ethiopian Tewahedo record signals this shift through accumulation rather than announcement. Judges begins to layer violence, deception, and internal betrayal without introducing new divine commands. And the text does not escalate God's speech. It multiplies human consequence. Now listen to how internal violence is framed here. From the Ethiopian record, Judges 19:22 says, "And behold," this is Ethiopian, "and behold, the men of the city, sons of lawlessness, surrounded the house, beating on the door, and they spoke to an old man, the master of the house, saying, 'Bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him.'" Well, the language here is pretty stark, but it's controlled. The men are not named as lawless. They say the sons of lawlessness. The act is exposed, and God does not speak here. The silence is deliberate. Now hear this in the King James, Judges 19:22. And I quote King James, "Now as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, certain sons of Belial, beset the house around about and beat at the door." Well, the phrase sons of Belial carries moral weight, but the emotional framing can feel dramatic. Spoken beside the Ethiopian cadence, the difference looks clear to me. One names lawlessness, the other intensifies character. So the event itself remains unchanged. But what follows is even more revealing. The Ethiopian record does not attribute what happens next to divine will. It actually records it. Judges 19:25 says, Ethiopian. "So the man took his concubine and brought her out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And when the dawn came, they let her go." So there's no justification, no commentary, no divine instruction. The horror is human and unfiltered. The King James reads, Judges 19:25, I quote King James, "But the men would not hearken to him. So the man took his concubine and brought her forth unto them, and they knew her and abused her all the night until the morning." So both records agree. God does not command this. God does not interrupt it. The restraint that once intervened earlier in Judges is no longer present here. And that's why we get this story. God isn't helping them. Now listen to what this produces. The Ethiopian text records the response of the tribes in Judges 28. And all the people arose as one man, saying, none of us will go to his tent, nor will any of us turn back to his house. This is Ethiopian. So unity appears, but it's not righteous unity. It's outrage-driven cohesion. The King James echoes this in Judges 28. And all the people arose as one man, saying, we will not any of us go to his tent, neither will we any of us turn into his house. So spoken alone, this can sound like moral resolve. Spoken in context, it is reaction without discernment. Now listen carefully to how God is consulted. The Ethiopian record records in Judges 20:18. And the children of Israel arose and went up to Bethel and asked counsel of God. So the act of inquiry remains, the posture here does not. The King James mirrors it in Judges 20:18. And the children of Israel arose and went up to the house of God and asked counsel of God. But what follows here is devastating. Despite seeking counsel, the tribes suffer massive losses. Judges 20:21 in the Ethiopian text reads, and I quote Ethiopian, and the children of Benjamin went out against them from Gibeah and destroyed on that day 22,000 men of Israel. Well, the King James says the same thing. It says, and I quote, and the children of Benjamin came forth out of Gibeah and destroyed down to the ground of the Israelites that day 22,000 men. God does not intervene to prevent this. He does not override the momentum of human outrage mixed with partial obedience. Judges is now showing something unmistakable here. Seeking God while remaining internally disordered does not prevent catastrophe. Consultation without submission does not restore protection. The Ethiopian cadence preserves this as exposure. God allows the collision to occur because nothing remains that can restrain it without falsifying reality. So the King James, when read without comparison, can sound as though God is directing them into slaughter. Read alongside the Ethiopian text, the truth actually sharpens. God is not commanding chaos. He is allowing what has been chosen to fully manifest. And by now, the listener should be able to feel it. The problem is no longer whether God will act. It is whether anything remains in the people capable of receiving correction. And it was simple correction. Stop sinning. But they just loved killing, stealing, murdering, just lying. Judges has crossed a line here. But it's not because God has changed. It's because the people have. So the collapse is no longer cyclical, it's cumulative. And once collapse becomes cumulative, restraint can no longer preserve a nation. So as Judges nears its close, the text stops cycling and starts concluding. Nothing is new that's introduced. Okay, nothing new is introduced. Hang tight. No fresh warning is issued. The book allows the accumulated evidence to speak for itself, and it does so with one final repeated line. In the Ethiopian, Judges 21:25 says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Well, now we know what happens when you practice anarchy. If you are a nation under God, there is no emotion attached to the sentence here. No condemnation is layered into it. It functions as a summary and not a rebuke. So the book ends by naming the condition that has been governed everything by the listener and what the listener has already seen. So the King James renders the same line as in, and I quote King James, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So the wording is nearly identical, yet the placement here is crucial. This line is not a suggestion. It's a verdict rendered by evidence. Judges does not argue its case. It documents it until the conclusion becomes unavoidable. So what this final statement does not say actually matters just as much. It does not say God abandoned Israel. It does not say the covenant failed. It does not say judgment escalated. It says reference collapsed. So throughout Judges, God spoke when necessary. He delivered when collapse threatened annihilation. He withdrew restraint when mercy was being exploited. And by the end, nothing remains to intervene against except the people's own standard, because they have made themselves the measure. They were testing God. And the Ethiopian cadence preserves this as diagnosis. The book closes without drama because drama would distract from the truth. The condition has fully been exposed. The King James, when read without comparison, can actually make the phrase feel like political commentary or lament. But read alongside the Ethiopian text, it lands as theological conclusion. Authority detached from covenant does not disappear. It relocates inward where it fragments. And remember, I've told you guys before, the Ethiopian canon complements the King James Bible. I'm not saying legally that somehow Rome changed it. I don't know. It looks like it. But what I am saying is that the King James Version, read alongside the Ethiopian canon, paints a much bigger picture of God and his actions and the reason behind them. And so, read side by side, in my opinion, would be the most healthiest way to go about it. One, it doesn't just throw away the King James Version, even though I do believe in my heart that they've changed enough to where if you stick to the Ethiopian canon, you'll be just fine. However, you can still use the case that there's nothing wrong with King James. Yeah, it's a great Bible. I love it. But the Ethiopian canon, it's the flesh that's needed on the skeleton of the King James. So that is crucial to understand because, one, if you're going to go out there and posture the Ethiopian over King James, you're going to hurt a lot of people, because I included were one of those who were following the King James without doing any research in the background of where the words actually came from. But when put together, you can say, I believe the Ethiopian canon fills in all of those questions that I have had that the King James just simply isn't giving me. And that is a theological safe way to go. Now, the King James, when read without comparison, it can make the phrase feel like political commentary or lament. And read alongside the Ethiopian text, it lands theological conclusion, just what I just said. It relocates inward where it fragments. As authority is detached from covenant, it does not disappear. So Judges, it actually ends without resolution because resolution would be dishonest. The people are not ready for restoration. They were testing God. Now, when I say the people, I'm not saying all of the millions of people. I don't know how many were there at the time. I think, 1 million, 2 million? Maybe less, maybe half of that. I don't remember. But it wasn't all of them. It was their leaders. And none of them stood up to their leaders, and none of them basically, warned them about the sins that they were committing. And so if you're not holding your leaders accountable, the devil's going to come in, steal your lunch, and pop the bag. So Judges ends without resolution because resolution would be dishonest. And the final line prepares the ground for what comes next. And not merely by explaining it, but by proving why it will be demanded. When everyone becomes their own authority, violence really multiplies. Unity becomes reactive, and righteousness dissolves into preference. Look at it this way. Let's say that immediate civil war comes to America, and let's just say, for example, it's blue state against red state. Let's just say that. If you're living in a red state and you are a blue state person, you may not be interested in the laws of the red state. Therefore, you may have justification because, hey, They are at war with you and your morals and ideologies. Thus, more violence and distortion and problems are going to arise. That's just it. And if you look at the history of civil wars, the amounts of just murder, mayhem, rape, you name it, that goes hand in hand with civil wars. So God does not shout this conclusion. He's been recording it. And Judges, it closes as it lived. It closes as it restrained, as it was honest, and it was unflinching. God's trying to show us in this book what happens to those who worship other gods. Pre-Jesus dying for our sins, as that changes the law. But the mirror here is held steadily one last time. The mirror, to look themselves in their face and ask themselves honestly if they are holding up their ancestors' part of the bargain. Freedom without remembered obedience does not produce life. It produces collapse that no amount of rescue can actually permanently heal. And with that, Judges ends. But it's not with fire, and it's not with fury, but with truth fully revealed and no excuses remaining. And the King James Bible, you can read it if you weren't understanding just history and theology. You would just walk away with, that is an angry God. But reading it alongside with the Tewahedo, the Ethiopian canon, you would walk away going, those people were wicked, and God did everything he possibly could. That is what holds true scripture together. Now, Judges does not end in isolation. It actually ends in preparation. The final collapse recorded is not meant to stand alone. It is meant to explain why what follows becomes inevitable. The book does not solve the problem it exposes. It actually hands the problem forward. Now, the Ethiopian Tewahedo record always allows this handoff to happen quietly. After the final declaration that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, while the silence itself becomes instructional. God does not offer immediate correction. He allows the weight of the condition to settle. The people are left with the full result of self-rule. Self-rule is collapse. Self-rule is evil. If you're going to live next to God, and they were living next to God, God was in their presence during that time. So this hopefully prepares you guys for what comes next. In the Ethiopian tradition, the movement from judges toward kingship is not framed as ambition, but really as exhaustion. The people have learned that freedom without memory cannot sustain justice. The demand for structure does not rise from faithfulness, but from collapse. The King James preserves the same trajectory. When people later say in 1 Samuel, which we're going to be doing, I believe, in a couple more nights, now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. Well, the request does not emerge in a vacuum. Judges has already shown why this demand feels necessary. It should, after reading the Ethiopian and King James side by side, you will know, now I know why they want a king, because they know self-governance is going to lead to violence. So Judges has already shown why this demand feels necessary. And the people are no longer asking for righteousness. They are asking for containment. Now listen how God responds when the request comes, because Judges has already prepared the ear. The Ethiopian record later preserves God's words. It says, I quote Ethiopian. They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. This is not a surprise. It's recognition. Judges has already proven the shift away from internal covenant toward external control. The King James echoes it clearly. It says, and I quote, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. The agreement is complete. The difference is not doctrine. It's just simple trajectory. Judges teaches that when a people cannot carry obedience internally, they will seek to impose order externally. We need a king. So structure becomes a substitute for submission. But why do they need a king when God was their king in the first place? Well, we want a man. Why? So they can manipulate the king. You got to understand. You think that it's all of the people in agreement here against God, when you're not seeing it like your own country, where it's their senators and congressmen and their judicial house and all of their branches of governments. It's them making the petitions and requests of God, not the people. It was never the people to begin with. This is what God is trying to show us. It's not the individual. That's not the problem. The problem is the leaders that were chosen that the people don't hold accountable to their own position. And all throughout this, we can see it happening country by country, time after time, all throughout history. The Bible is a great reference point to what happens to countries when they reach certain levels. And Judges teaches that when a people cannot carry obedience internally, they're going to seek a king. So structure here becomes a substitute for submission. Authority is relocated into office because it has failed in conscience. This does not mean kingship is evil. It means kingship becomes necessary because something more essential has already been lost. Judges explains why the people will later tolerate oppression from a king that they could not endure from God. External rule feels safer than internal accountability. And the Ethiopian cadence preserves this as consequence, not punishment. God allows the request because it reflects the true condition of the people. The King James, read alone, can sound like God reluctantly giving in. And read after Judges, it sounds like God honoring choice. Well, this is unmistakable. Judges is not the story of chaos alone. It is the argument for why centralized authority will arise next, even at great cost. The people do not move toward a king because they have matured. They move toward a king because they are unable to sustain freedom. And by the time Judges ends, the question then is no longer whether God will rule his people. The real question is, how will he do so when covenant memory has completely collapsed? What do you mean it says you can't lie? We're us senators and congressmen and the American judicial branches of government. What do you mean we can't lie? We need to keep the peace, to restore order. You see what I mean? It's not the people, it's the leaders. And God was trying to get them about a people, and to have him as the king, not to select leaders to do their work. Because that doesn't work either, as we will find in 1st and 2nd Kings. Judges does not answer that question. It proves why it must be asked. How he will do so when covenant memory has collapsed. And that's why Judges does not conclude with restoration. It concludes with necessity. What comes next is not a solution, but a concession to reality. The book ends having done its own work. It has shown what unrestrained choice produces, and it has prepared you guys to understand why the next chapter of Israel's history will be marked not by deliverers, but by crowns. And by the end of Judges, the question is no longer whether God has been patient enough. The record has already answered that. The question really remains is whether patience alone can preserve a people who no longer retain covenant within themselves. Remember, if they want to murder someone, that's on them. Self-rule. The Ethiopian Tewahedo record does not dramatize this moment at all, and it does not excuse their behavior. It simply closes the case. Judges 21:25 is not an emotional statement, it's a legal one. And it says, and I quote, "In those days there was no king in Israel, every man did what was right in his own eyes," unquote. The repetition is intentional, folks. The condition has been fully demonstrated, and the verdict is now being beyond dispute. So the King James repeats the same line without any alteration either. It says, I quote King James, "In those days there was no king in Israel, every man did that which was right in his own eyes." Nothing is added, nothing is explained. Judges ends by placing responsibility exactly where it belongs. To the people of Israel and their chosen leaders, and them not following the 10 Commandments. And what this final statement confirms is that the problem is not the absence of law. The law exists, but the problem is not the absence of God. God has spoken repeatedly. He's still there. He hasn't left. The problem is the absence of internal submission. Authority has been detached from obedience and relocated into preference. Basically, politics got involved. People got in groups. Groups got favor with money and funds, started taking over their area. That's what happens. Favoritism, secret societies, deals that are being done behind closed tents. And throughout Judges, God never redefines righteousness to accommodate this shift. God never lowers his standard. He never calls disorder good. Instead, he allows the people to experience what their chosen posture produces once restraint is no longer constantly reinforced. So Judges proves something difficult but necessary. A people can receive mercy repeatedly and still deteriorate. Deliverance can interrupt collapse without curing the disease. Freedom, when divorced from remembered obedience, does not mature into righteousness. It just fragments into chaos. So the Ethiopian cadence preserves this truth without theatrical language, as God's character remains consistent from beginning to end. What changes is how much intervention remains possible without falsifying reality. And by the end, intervention itself would only conceal what must now be seen. So the King James, when read without comparison, can make the conclusion feel bleak or even punitive. Read alongside the Ethiopian record, it feels honest. Judges is not condemning Israel. It is diagnosing a condition that can no longer be ignored. And this is why Judges does not offer restoration at the close. Restoration requires repentance that endures, not reaction that fades. What the people are prepared for now is not healing, but structure. And that, too, will come at a huge cost. Judges does not fail to resolve because God withholds mercy. It refuses to resolve because the truth must stand long enough to be recognized. Only then can the next chapter of Israel's history be understood without illusion. Judges ends having said everything that needs to be said. Covenant was given, mercy was shown, restraint was applied and withdrawn. And so the result is now visible. What follows will not be an accident. It will be the logical continuation of what has already been chosen. And with that, the book of Judges closes, not with anger, not with despair, but with the truth that's so plain it no longer needs any more explanation, especially if you read it between the King James and the Ethiopian Tewahedo. So to conclude, Judges does not leave you guys confused about God. It should leave you guys now confronted with humanity. From beginning to end, the record preserves a God who remains consistent in warning, patience in mercy, and restrained in judgment. What changes across the book is not his posture, but the people's capacity to carry what they have been given. The Ethiopian Tewahedo record makes this especially clear. God does not escalate his anger as the book darkens. He speaks less because he has already spoken enough. They know that they're breaking the law. So restraint is withdrawn not as punishment. He doesn't like to be played with. They were testing his limits. But the restraint is withdrawn not as punishment, but as just complete honesty. He ain't going to play that game. And when mercy no longer produces remembrance, allowing consequence becomes the only way truth can actually remain visible. So you shouldn't be seeing an angry God here. If you read beside it, the King James can sound harsher to modern ears, and certain words carry emotional weight that can make God appear reactive or volatile. Yet when two records are heard together, the continuity actually sharpens. God is not igniting chaos. He is permitting what has been chosen to fully manifest once intervention would only conceal it. Judges shows that deliverance without formation cannot heal a people. Mercy can interrupt collapse, but it cannot replace obedience. Authority detached from covenant does not disappear. It relocates inward, where it fragments into preference and impulse, self-rule. So the result is not freedom, but disintegration. And this is why Judges ends without restoration. That's the logical conclusion that happens to a people who mock, play around with God, and him loving them, taking a step back, saying, okay, you want to run yourself, I got it. And this is why Judges ends without restoration, as restoration requires repentance that endures, not cries that fade once relief arrives. The book closes only after every excuse has been exhausted, every cycle exposed, and every illusion removed. What remains is truth fully visible and responsibility clearly assigned. Judges is not a threat. It is a mirror. And it was written so future generations would recognize the cost of forgetting covenant before demanding structure to contain the chaos that follows. God does not abandon his people in this record. He just refuses to lie to them. And in that refusal, Judges accomplishes its purpose. It prepares the ground for what comes next, not by offering answers, but by ensuring the questions can no longer be avoided. This has been Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Tune in tomorrow night when God gives me another revelation to tell you guys all about it. Until then, God bless and Godspeed.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.